Hey guys, I've got bad news for you. You're not going to want to hear this. Your clients aren't going to want to hear it. Your bosses aren't going to want to hear it. But your web analytics data is wrong. Let's talk about why. Okay, way back in the ancient past, web analytics was like this new, unique thing where we had huge amount of insight into who was coming to the site. We could trace it back to individuals even. If they signed up for an email, we knew who was doing what, buying what, where they came from, all this gorgeous, rich information about all of our customers. And it was really so much different than what we'd been used to for, direct mail or print or television or any of those other outlets where you could only really measure by trying certain things like adding a unique catalog code to a catalog, or having different phone numbers on the catalog so you could understand if they called in from that or if they called in from a mail piece. You could kind of see if sales went up if you ran a TV spot or a radio spot, but you didn't have exact numbers. You just generally knew intuitively, or tried your best to measure lifts in sales corresponding to the advertising that you were doing. If you had a billboard, something like that, there was really no way for you to tell what was driving business. Did the billboard work? Maybe, maybe not. If you had a specific phone number on it, you could potentially track it from there. But it was not an exact science by any means. Well, here comes the internet and web analytics, and now it is more of an exact science because you have data. You know exactly what that person clicked on. You know if it contributed to a sale or a lead, and you were able to say, this is where you should spend your advertising dollars. You should put it in this program because we know exactly how much you're spending. But here's the problem. People get freaked out when you know that much information about them. I mean, we would, have very explicit knowledge about John Smith buying a certain product, and here's the marketing channels that he used. People don't want that. They don't want to see that. It's a little creepy. I get creeped out just by seeing, ads about something that, I clicked on and they're retargeting me and they're remarketing to me. That's creepy, and I'm a marketer. So, people don't like to know that their information's being followed, that you have that data about them. And so what people started to do was started to use things like ad blockers, or they started to use browsers like Tor or Brave or some of the other ones that like DuckDuckGo that will block not only ads from showing up because those are annoying, and I can say that as a marketer, but they will also block in some cases the analytics tracking on the websites. And so that way they can, not be tracked when they're visiting a website. And no, incognito on Chrome does not block all of your information. That has led to some problems with Google. But people use incognito under the assumption that it is somehow keeping them secret and people aren't tracking them. Incognito just isn't saving it in your search, in your history on your machine. But there are browsers like Brave and Tor and browsers like that will block the tracking, the cookies, and the tracking in general. So because of that growing concern where you had individuals using these browsers and using these ad blocking tools, the European Union jumped on the bandwagon. And they said, you know what, it is creepy that these companies are tracking this information. And they're using things like third-party cookies that track you from site to site to site. This is one of the reasons why if you see, pop-ups from Facebook and Google that are based on behavior that you've done on the website, but not on something you've searched for, it's because they're using cookies to track your behavior on those other sites. So there's third-party cookies on a lot of those sites. A lot of people have, Facebook or Google cookies installed on their websites. Those could track you via third party. So that means that it didn't trigger on the people that own that website. Companies are tracking you. And they're using that to model you to understand your buying behavior so that way they can serve you up better ads or ads more to your liking, or they know if you're more likely to purchase certain types of things. And so Google and Facebook can get very specific about who they're serving those ads to. And it's creepy. Nobody wants them to be able to do that. So the EU has passed some pretty rigorous laws called GDPR that are restricting the use of private information. And it's why you see on a lot of websites now, the little pop-up that says that we use cookies and that kind of stuff. And in some cases, you can click, no, I reject this. I don't want to use those cookies. Now, that tends to be on sites that do business in Europe or their European websites. A lot of US sites aren't great about that, although there are laws in California and some other states that are growing to be more similar to GDPR. And so you see more and more sites that have that pop-up that says, hey, we use cookies. Now, in the US, we typically just acknowledge that, that we do. It doesn't necessarily keep the tracking from happening. But for a lot of sites, if you say reject, it will actually keep the tracking from happening. And what does that mean? That means your Google Analytics tags are probably not firing. And so there is a certain percentage of people now that are either using private browsers that are impeding your traffic or your tracking. They're using ad blockers, which many by default will strip Google Analytics tracking off of your site so that you can't, it's not firing for them. Or there is they're rejecting the use of cookies on your site, and you're not tracking them that way. So, a lot of people are like, well, how many people actually do that, right? Well, it's a lot of people. So let's take a look at some of the numbers. Oh, and I forgot to mention the more recent release of the iPhone, the Safari private mode strips out analytics as well. And there's about 7.7% of iPhone users use the browse private mode, and that blocks GA4 and other tools. And the iPhone is 58% of the US market, especially with the younger demographic. So not only is it 58% of the market, but then almost 8% of those people are actually blocking your analytics. So if they're coming to your site on a mobile phone, you're not seeing them. And that's a pretty large bucket of people, particularly if you're appealing to a demographic that tends to skew younger or is more technically astute. 37% of international users are using ad blocking. So just think about that. So over a third of people from the internationally are using ad blocking. And again, many of those ad blockers by default will block Google Analytics. So, and then 63% of people in the 18 to 34 range use ad blockers. Now, again, they don't all by default strip out Google Analytics, but many of them do. About 26% of users in the United States have also installed some sort of ad blocking software, plugin, or browser as of 2020. So you're starting to get the trend here. There's large numbers of people that are actively blocking not just ads, but also analytics tracking. And then a study in the UK showed that about 70% of UK users are actively blocking cookies. Again, if you have a European market that you're appealing to or marketing to, this is going to affect you more because they are acutely aware of the needs to block privacy. It's a much bigger issue in Europe, even though the UK is no longer part of the EU. The laws there in the EU are pretty stringent. So what that means is that, and we're seeing it with our clients, is drops in traffic to the site. And keep in mind, this is tracking, anything that they do on your site. So it's the visit itself, but it's also purchases. And how do we know this is happening? Well, we know for some of our clients, it's as high as 20 to 30% of people visiting their site that you're not seeing any data for. And we know this because we're seeing other data come through. So we're seeing, for instance, the amount of purchases that GA4 is reporting is much lower than what is actually being processed in the commerce system, whether it's their ERP or whether it's something like Shopify. You're going to see a dramatic difference in some cases between the sales and purchases that are coming through in your platform and what's being reported in GA4. Now, that will even out in some cases because often GA4 isn't tracking, returns and stuff like that. So it's a demand number. It's not an accounting number. You can set it up so that GA4 can get returns and stuff like that. But that aside, we are seeing that difference. And that's how we know with some of our clients that in some cases it's 20, 30% of people that are not being tracked to your website. Now, is this the end of analytics tracking? No. And, some of the companies are really making an effort to try to come up with new ways to get a better understanding of these numbers. So when we try to explain this to our clients and our bosses when they're looking at these numbers, they're like, what do you mean we can't track 20 or 30% of the people? It must be broken. There must be something wrong with the installation and the implementation of your analytics. Well, in some cases that can be true. We actually have another video that I'll link to that talks about why some of your numbers might be wrong and why some of those implementation things can impact that, as well as the speed of your site. But in this case, it's much more about what people are doing proactively to block your analytics. So what we tell people is that you can still look at the data, directionally, right? So it's not an exact number. It's not accounting data. Not every sale is going to be on there. But what it does tell you is that probably the same percentage of people are blocking the analytics across different channels in most cases. So that directionally, the performance of those marketing channels are going to be the same amount, right? So your paid search is probably going to be off by the same amount that your organic search is going to be off, that your social media search is off. So you can still tell which of those is performing better, which ones tend to drive more traffic, which tend to convert. So you can look at directional data. So don't get caught up in the fact that you might be missing, X number of orders, or there might be X number of visitors that are missing from the report. You can still understand what's performing. So you can still optimize for SEO. You can still optimize for your paid search program. Directionally what is and what isn't working. So you are getting some data which will help you manage those programs. The other thing that you can do is when using tools that like GA4 and the Google tools, they are theoretically addressing some of these privacy issues, and they're moving away from things like third-party cookies, right? And what they're doing is they're looking at, GA4 was really created to be an event-based model. So it's not as dependent on cookies and, looking at session-based stuff like Universal Analytics was. So it's looking at those events that are continually triggered. It's not as dependent on storing and recording cookies. The other thing that GA4 is doing that's a little vague, I guess is the right way to put it, is they're using modeling, right? So one of the things that they did in Universal Analytics is do a lot of traffic modeling. Well, they're expanding that. Google's using all of the data that they gather, just the terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of data about user behavior, about your traffic, about your user behavior. And they're using models to understand, where people are coming from, where they're likely to convert. Like I said, in Explore, some of that data is actually modeled. So if you're looking at a longer date range of reporting, it'll actually tell you like, hey, we're only using, 40% of your data to model this. So the numbers they're showing you are not actually real numbers. Those are model numbers. They're statistical numbers based on all the data and the data science that they have to back that. So they're using event models, machine learning. They're focusing on things like first-party cookies, which those are cookies that are launched by your site. Sometimes those are going to be blocked by ad blockers, but it's something that they're at least saying to places like the EU and stuff like that, like, hey, we're making some efforts here. Please don't shut us off entirely. So the other thing that you can do is there are some server-side implementations that you can look at for GA4 that will help with some of the blocking that happens, but it's not going to cover all of them. But that is something that people are doing. They're, rather than just deploying it in the code, like in the HTML, they're actually putting server-side tracking for GA4 on their sites. And so that's one of the things that you can do. It's not going to completely help the inaccuracy that we're seeing in some of the data. So what can you do about this going forward? Well, not that much. It's just really educating your teams, your clients, and your executives that Google Analytics and the analytics coming from various other tools have never been, 100% accurate. There's always disparity between the tools, either because of how they're implemented, how they trigger on your site, how they do or don't credit certain marketing programs, what day it's associated with. So there's always been differences between tools. They've never been, 100% accurate. So that was kind of a myth that, we like to perpetuate, that, hey, this is a lot better than print, right? Well, we're getting into the world where, we have to look at this as a directional number, and we have to say, this is something that we need to understand. We're going to try to account for this as much as possible, but where it's not accounting data. So it's a hard truth that many executives are going to have to increasingly become used to dealing with. And it's something that you're going to have to get in front of it and educate them about. And hopefully this was helpful in starting that discussion. So if you're doing things with your organization that's helping you guys get better accuracy of your data, if you have studies that you've done that has a more, granular idea of what percentages you're looking at, we'd love to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. And of course, as always, stop back by. We'll have more content like this in the near future, and we'll talk to you soon.